back to part 2 of the lecture on printmaking in Unit 7. When we last left off, we were talking about etchings. We talked about Rembrandt and his etchings, and now I wanted to talk about Mezzotint. And before I talk about Mezzotint, I do have to cover one thing, which is dry point. I don't have any images to represent it, but besides engraving, there's another form of printmaking where the artist doesn't use any kind of acid. That's called dry point, where they just use a thin stylus and they scratch kind of relatively lightly, not as deeply as they would do in an engraving. And the main difference between an engraving and a dry point is because in a dry point, it's the burr along the edge of that line that holds the ink, which means you don't have to put as much pressure, but it also means that the print doesn't hold the ink for as long, right? So that you can't make as big an addition. Meaning that you can only print it a couple, like maybe 10 times before it starts to get really faint. And I'm explaining all that because Mezzotint is technically a form of dry point. What Mezzotint is one of a number of technologies that were sort of developed, invented to try to figure out how to make tones in printmaking instead of just building up through line, how to make soft and gradual tone shifts in printmaking. And the way Mezzotint works is that you take a metal plate, and the first thing you do is you get this tool called a rocker, and it's basically like a handle with a curved piece of metal, and the curved piece of metal has all these little tiny teeth on it, and you rock it back and forth over the plate, and you cut thousands and thousands and thousands of different tiny little marks into the plate, just little kind of teeth grabbing marks over and over again. And you hire someone, usually like a printmaker would have a studio assistant who'd have the job, and they'd be working for like maybe a week just rocking back and forth all over the plate until the plate is covered with these marks. And if it's completely covered and completely even with these marks, if you then ink that plate and printed it, it would print black. It would just print really, really rich dark. And then the artist comes in and they start sanding away areas. And the more they sand, the lighter that area gets because the more they're removing the burr. The less they sand, the more those areas are dark. And they can basically kind of create these very soft, subtle gradations of value by basically scuffing up the whole plate, putting all these tiny little marks, and then sanding back to create areas of light. But it still has that same principle that once you're done with it, you have to ink it and then wipe it and then run it through a press and print it. Another system that was designed to kind of also solve this problem of how do we get various kinds of tone in printmaking was a system called Aquatint. And the way this works is, well, if you remember, pause for a second, if you remember we talked about etchings and how etchings have this kind of rubbery surface called a ground that goes over the plate. Well, the ground could be dried and it can be ground up, right? Dried and ground up until it's like a fine, like a powder. And what you can do with that is you can take a plate and you can sprinkle the powder over the whole plate and then heat it up. And then each one of these little, grains of powder will start to melt and become this little spot of rubber sticking to that plate. So you can cover the plate and then basically have all these little tiny dots and then put the plate in an acid bath, right? And what it's going to do is it's going to dig lines into all the spots that aren't covered, and it's going to, or like dig little kind of holes, and all the spots that are covered by those little tiny grains are going to be light. And so you can basically mask off different areas and put a very little bit of ground or a little bit more of ground, and the more ground you put, the lighter the tone will be, and the less ground, the darker the tone will be. And by using this, you can create all kinds of different variations of tone. So Aquatint is really a type of etching where you're using the powdered form of the ground, whereas Mezzotint was a form of dry point where you're right on the tool, using this rocker to make all those little tiny marks. Now, lithography is a completely different form of printmaking. Let's go back for a second, all the way to this page, right? Lithography is a form of planographic printmaking, meaning that really the surface doesn't change at all. The surface is not cut into, it's not raised, or not, or cut down. It basically is just flat. So then how does the image transfer in a lithograph? Well, it's a very tricky, if I had the time, I'd tell you the story of how lithography was invented. But the basic premise is a man discovered that on a, if you have like a stone block, like um, uh, if you have a stone block, right? It has to be a specific kinds of stone, and then you draw on it with a grease marker. That it can then be inked, and the grease will hold the ink, and the places that aren't will not hold the ink. And that's a basic premise. So let's say Daumier here making this lithograph. What he had to do was he had to take this piece of limestone, right? And he had to draw on it with a grease marker. And then after that, he had to lightly acid the stone so that it's very porous. And then he has to he has to dampen the whole stone, put water on it, right? And then he inks the stone. And everywhere that the water is sitting up on that stone, right, the water is resist to ink, to an oil-based ink. So the ink is not going to stick anywhere that the water is. But all the spots where the grease marker is, because the grease is also ink, is also oily, the ink is going to stick to that grease marker. So he basically then has this version that's holding this ink, right? And then he can put a piece of paper over it, and then a press presses down pressure onto the lithostone, and he gets a print. And you can make lots of prints this way. It's a really quite a miraculous system. I've done a little bit of printmaking that way. It's very interesting. So one of the things that's fun about lithography is that it allows you to make allows you to make a print that has a lot of the gesture of a drawing, a lot of the hand that someone has in a drawing. And another thing that's interesting about lithography is that it really kind of made doing multiple colors a lot easier. By this point, people were already doing multiple colors in intaglio in Europe, and of course we saw that in Japan they were doing multiple colors in block printing and relief printing. But litho became the most popular form of doing multicolored printmaking, especially for advertisements in Europe, as we can see here. And lastly, we're going to talk about screen printing, which is a form of stencil-based printmaking. And so in screen printing, you don't have a plate, you don't have a thing that the ink sticks to or is placed on, and then the paper is pressed up to it. Instead, you have a screen, which is basically like a stencil, and the screen, the ink pushes through the screen. So you figure out on the screen a way to block some parts, and so that the ink can't transfer through, and then other places where the ink does transfer through. And screen printing allows you to do lots of different colors. And ooh, we're running out of time. And oh shoot, there's something I'm missing out. I'm going to do a part 3 because I had some contemporary printmakers I wanted to talk a little bit more about. But it'll be really short. All right, thank you.